All right. Good afternoon. It is November 20th in the fall of 2020 semester, and I have the great pleasure of having Lauren Palmieri with us, a graduate of JMU's history program, a BA in history in the spring of 2020, and a minor in Middle Eastern communities and migrations. And Lauren and I have prepared this dialogue to give her a chance to share with you, all viewers, some of her experiences at JMU as a history student and Middle Eastern studies student, and just learn a little bit more about her and her time at JMU. So Lauren, welcome to our informal podcast.
Thank you, Dr. Hanifi. I'm excited to be here.
That's great. It's great. So Lauren, you must have come to JMU then in the fall of what year? Would that have been 2017?
Fall of 2016, yes.
I'm off. I'm not a mathematician.
I'm not good at math either. That's all right.
JMU, Lauren.
Well, originally I did archery for many years, and I was part of an archery range in New Jersey, and JMU always hosted indoor nationals at JMU, actually. So I just kind of heard about it through that and figured I'd apply. You know, a lot of people would go there for the archery program, and they always talked about like the great community at JMU. So I applied to JMU through that, and then ended up falling in love with the history department, just loving all the opportunities that they had. And that's really what drew me into JMU the more that I went through my experience there, and really just enjoyed every moment of it.
So when you decided to apply to JMU, you were not a declared history major? Or when was it you declared your history major?
I was a declared history major. I knew I wanted to major in history. I knew I was kind of thinking going along the academia track and considering going through that ultimate goal to become a history professor. But at the time I thought I was going to do American history because that's all that I had really been exposed to in my high school experience. And what I liked about history was it had those thematic connections. I found that I was only viewing that through an American perspective. So what really changed for me coming into JMU was keeping that thematic perspective of history, but really bringing it out to the global scale.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. And then when did you become interested in the Middle East, and how did that component of your studies develop?
Yeah, it was pretty early on. I knew within like the first 2 or 3 weeks of my first semester that there was too much in the world for me to just stick to American history, and only having known that. And what I really enjoyed about doing Middle East history is because I found that so many of these terms that we use to describe the Middle East, and even the term Middle East itself, are used so casually, but have a lot of ingrained biases in them, or have a lot of misunderstandings or mislabelings attached to them, especially when you start talking about things like Islamic law. That tends to fuel a lot of prejudices. So I really like learning about Middle Eastern history because I could learn the historical and contemporary context of these terms and really know what they actually mean. I felt like there was like a sense of purpose in doing Middle East history, in the sense of like I had a mission to combat prejudices. And that's what really drew me in, because I knew that I liked history, so I would like anywhere in the world that I focused on. But I really liked the mission that came along with doing Middle East and Islamic history.
And that's wonderful. Lauren, do you have any particular highlights of history classes that you could share before discussing some of the highlights of your Middle East studies?
So many. Oh my God. Well, definitely it was His 101 with Dr. Fitzgerald that I took my first semester, because that's something that I always talk about that opened my eyes, because I was so naive before coming into that class. And that was the first class that really made me think about the world in a critical aspect. So I know I wouldn't have been on the same path that I was. And actually our colonialism in the Middle East and South Asia class, I really enjoyed that. That was definitely an impactful one, just because of the abstract concepts that we got to discuss every week at such a high level, and just learning how everything we see in our world today is so attached to colonialism and how it's become so deeply entrenched. And I loved the discussions that we had on languages and how language can be manipulated. It just brought in this perspective that everything is political and it's highly politicized. And even just from a logistical aspect, I feel very prepared for graduate school because of the rigor of that class. So both in like an intellectual and just a work ethic capacity, I feel like I've benefited a lot from that course.
Great. What was so nice to hear is that you're very early. Was that 101 experience with Dr. Fitzgerald in your very first semester?
Yes,
And then our class on colonialism, let's see, that would have been
that was my senior year.
before you graduated, but a senior
Yeah.
year. Uh, do you recall any sort of connections, just as someone who went through the whole history curriculum? Was there any sort of knot to the circle that you can tie for anyone? Did
Oh.
you find some relationships between the classes, for example?
I think the biggest relationship that I found between the classes is just that idea of language. I think that's something that comes through time to time again, and just how terms are being used, manipulated, what's involved with a name that I know we've talked about in your classes many times. So, what's involved with names and labels and how they're used, both in like historical context, but it's especially applied today when you see how everything becomes so easily politicized. So that was something that I've seen as a very broad thematic connection. I know if I thought about it, I could probably find more concrete historical details, but language is definitely the biggest connection I've seen throughout classes.
That's wonderful for students of history to hear how important the language we use to study history, the concepts and terms. That's wonderful.
Absolutely, yeah.
Enjoy.
Decline is the biggest term that comes up to problematize.
You probably got that discussion right off the bat in History 101, I
Oh
bet.
yeah, yeah, and especially with the Ottoman Empire, just pushing back on that idea of decline, it comes up a lot.
Oh, yeah, what a debate that
Oh
is.
yeah.
Lauren, I know you also had some wonderful study abroad experiences through JMU. Could you share a little bit about those with us,
I
please?
did. I went through CIEE and was able to transfer the credits to JMU. They offer both semester long and summer programs. So I did a summer Arabic language program in Amman, Jordan. And what was really valuable about that was my first time setting foot in the Middle East really in my life. So even apart from just having that intensive language study, it was something where I was like, okay, this is a field that I want to get my PhD in and really dedicate my life towards studying. It was just that confirmation that I felt like I enjoyed what I was studying and this was the right path for me. And just, the culture that you experience and all that, expanding your intellectual horizons and just having that on the ground experience of being in a region is just so invaluable. And more informally, I spent a month in the West Bank the summer after my junior year. And even though I wasn't in a classroom, I was just there volunteering on a Palestinian farm. That was something where, after learning about Palestine through my classes, I was able to go and really think critically about these concepts of like mobility and water and how these things are so, especially like how water has become so politicized in both Palestine and many other locations. That was something that was really um, just different to grasp with, and just something that you wouldn't really think about, and just being able to see that on the ground. And I remember like outside of the showers they would have signs saying water is golden, like please keep your showers brief, like the like informal currency of water almost. It was really just an outlandish experience.
Right. I remember um, your return from that adventure and seeing uh, a renewed appreciation for the
Yeah,
mobility. I remember discussing
yeah,
specifically the difficulties of movement and the importance of that. So you
absolutely.
said in your first experience in the Middle East, you knew that you were committed to getting a PhD, a doctorate in history, I think you said, and you're
Yeah.
well on your way. You've left JMU. Can you tell us something about where you are currently stationed and what the variables are with your
Oh,
career
yes.
adventure?
A lot feels up in the air during this year,
Yeah.
but I have received a Fulbright Award to Kuwait to continue some of the research that I've done for my thesis and exploring female literary networks in the 19th and 20th century Middle East. Unfortunately, since COVID kind of pushed around a lot of Fulbright Awards, I don't think I'll be able to go because I am starting my graduate program for my master's in history at NYU in the fall. And what I really want to focus more on, that I felt like it was easier to do research on more modern eras, when you're just working from like your laptop and carrier library. So what I'm really looking forward to for my master's is being able to expand into early modern history and to really work with the early modern Ottoman Empire, do a lot of gender history. So I'm really looking forward towards that as well in the fall.
I remember the really important focus on journalism and gender in your thesis.
Yeah.
Could you perhaps tell us something about that? Was an honors thesis, was it not?
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
Yep. Could you please just tell us something about that process and the rewards that you took from putting together a really fine research project, and maybe also about your other publications?
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah. So doing a thesis is definitely a long process. It definitely takes a lot of dedication. There are definitely times when you feel like you're just having a mental break and hitting that research wall of, I don't know where to go with this. I don't know what I'm doing. But in the end, it's so worth it. And it's such a value process. For me, what I did for my thesis is I was definitely interested in women and gender in the Middle East. I knew that's something that I wanted to really explore in detail because there are a lot of stereotypes and prejudices surrounding women in the Middle East. And it relates to things that we've discussed in your classes where, there's that very corporal understanding of what it means to be oppressed and suffering. And that's detracting from real issues like health, safety, and education. So I wanted to focus on those real issues, like education was a particular focus of mine. So I was focusing on education, literacy, and this general broad idea of female autonomy. So what I found is that this magazine, Al Fatah, which was published in Alexandria, Egypt from 1892 to 1894, I found that it was broadly mentioned as this magazine that was the catalyst for a broader female literary movement. But there weren't many studies, or really any studies, that were giving dedicated to attention to Al Fatah in itself, and just exploring the ways in which this magazine exercised its mobility, the contradictions in it, the tensions in it. So what I did is, what I most interesting about the magazine, what I really focused my thesis on, was that the magazine claimed to be apolitical and said that it had no aim in political matters. And I argued that the magazine, just by the very nature of the topics discussed, it was a highly political magazine. And these women were calling it apolitical in a way to sort of conform to the patriarchy, in a sense, in a way that they could advance their mission. So kind of making those like small goals here and there, where I know there will be articles saying, oh, like your wife, she's at home, she's such a great homemaker, so don't question it when she goes out. So kind of like making those like little steps towards that mobility and autonomy, and making those, and some articles even had explicit claims for the advancement of female education. So I just really enjoyed exploring the ways in which this magazine was political. And just in general, that was my first time doing really extensive research in Arabic. So the challenges and the benefits of that was definitely a rewarding process, and just being able to put together this massive piece of work was really exciting.
Well, and the use of primary sources is such a distinguishing feature of
Yeah.
that work. I know you also published another important paper that didn't make use of
Yes.
Arabic primary sources, but rather visual source materials.
Yes. Many maps.
Could you tell
Yeah,
us
that was
something
actually,
about that?
yeah, of course. That was actually with your class, for Afghanistan in regional and global context. And what the topic, like I've discussed before, that I've found myself becoming fascinated with, was the politicization of water. So I looked at the Indus and Oxus rivers in Afghanistan, and looked at the ways the British Empire were mapping the Indus and Oxus rivers surrounding the First and Second Anglo and Afghan wars, in the way they were manipulating these rivers and making these almost artificial boundaries that would suit their own interests, whether they were commercial or political, very territorial, especially with the Second Anglo-Afghan War. And one of the maps that I found most interesting was one by the British Boundary Commission, where they start mapping the boundaries along the Oxus River, and they have so many boundaries marked on it that you can't really see the river itself. And what really struck me with this map was how the British Boundary Commission labeled the British boundary, the actual boundary line, and the Afghan boundary was the perceived boundary line. So it was just this bizarre entitlement to like in Afghanistan, really, in the sense that they were restricting mobility still in another sense. And the point that I really wanted to make with that is how politicized maps are when they're coming out in those political wartime comments, and especially in the post 9/11 world that we live in. We can't take every map or every geography or every like characterization of Afghanistan we see, we can't take that at face value. And we really need to question the political motives behind it.
That's so wonderful. And that paper has appeared online at the Middle Eastern Communities and Migrations Student Research Paper Series. If anyone in the audience would like to check out Lauren's work, you can find it there. Lauren, I've really enjoyed this conversation. Thanks for taking time out of your very busy schedule as you prepare for either a Fulbright or NYU, or if luck can be shown upon us, both of them.
Yes, hopefully. Yes, thank you so much for having me. This was fun.
It's great, Lauren. Thanks a lot.
Thank
Talk to
you.
you soon.